Do you remember the African-American soul foods only your Black grandparents knew? They fed families with love, patience, and faith through hard times. What happens to our history when those flavors fade away? Smothered pork chops were the kind of meal that made the whole house quiet, except for the sound of gravy bubbling on the stove. You could smell it before you saw it. Thick onion gravy wrapping around fried pork until every bite turned tender and soft. It was never rushed, never careless, always cooked slow enough for the flavor to find its way inside. Families saved their best pan for it, the one that had seen birthdays and Sunday dinners and still held the shine of memory. There was pride in turning a cheap cut of meat into something that felt rich, even if you had almost nothing to work with. Children would sit nearby, waiting for that first plate, watching the steam rise like a promise. The cook never hurried, stirring slow, letting the onions melt into the gravy until it smelled like comfort itself. It wasn't fancy, but it felt sacred, a meal built from patience, love, and trust in what you had. Smothered pork chops weren't just food, they were proof that love could season anything, and patience could feed a family when money could not. Collard greens with smoked turkey necks simmered for hours, turning water into a broth so rich it felt like comfort itself. The smell filled every corner of the house, a slow promise that dinner was coming. You could hear the spoon scrape the bottom of the pot, gathering the greens that had softened just right. The turkey necks gave them body, salt, and soul, something smoky that reminded everyone of home. This was food that took time and taught you to wait, because flavor came to those who were patient. When the pot was opened, the steam carried stories of generations who had cooked the same way. Each bite brought warmth that spread from your chest to your spirit. The greens were never bitter, only bold, tasting like the land they grew from and the hands that harvested them. A bowl of greens could feed more than hunger. It fed pride, warmth, and memory all at once. Black-eyed peas and rice were a wish in a bowl, a meal that carried superstition and survival in equal measure. Grandparents cooked them every New Year's Day, believing each pea meant good fortune for the months ahead. Even on ordinary days, they were comfort food done right. Cheap, filling, and full of flavor from smoked meat and spices. The peas were soft but strong, the rice soaked up everything around it, and together they stretched one meal into two. The sound of a simmering pot was like a heartbeat in the kitchen, steady and sure. Families would gather with spoons ready, tasting for salt and love more than seasoning. You could eat it plain or with cornbread, but the real richness came from the story behind it. Every household had its own way to make it, but the meaning stayed the same: faith in small beginnings. You did not need much when you had a pot of black-eyed peas and the hope they brought with them. Oxtail stew was once poor man's food, but no one cared about that when it was bubbling in the pot. The meat cooked so long it slid right off the bone, blending into a broth thickened with onions, carrots, and patience. This was not fast food. It was time turned into tenderness. You could taste the work in every bite, the care that turned scraps into gold. Families gathered around it, spooning out bowls that steamed up their glasses and filled their hearts. Children waited for their turn, knowing that this stew meant love in its purest form. The pot sat heavy on the stove, simmering slow while the day stretched on. Each bowl carried the scent of garlic, pepper, and home. Oxtail stew wasn't about luxury. It was about skill, about making beauty out of what others threw away. It was a meal that said no matter how little you had, you could still make something worth remembering. Chitterlings took courage and care to make, a dish that started hard and ended soft. Grandmothers cleaned them slow, soaking and scrubbing until the smell faded and the story began. Boiled with vinegar, onions, and pepper, they turned into something rich, sharp, and unforgettable. Cooking them was an act of faith, passed down through hands that refused to waste a thing. The sound of the bubbling pot carried through the house, a reminder that strength came from the smallest places. Those who cooked chitterlings knew patience like few others did. It was work that took hours but ended in pride, not exhaustion. Served with hot sauce or cornbread, they told the story of making beauty out of survival. Chitterlings were survival food, but they also spoke of pride, a reminder that nothing was beneath transformation. Every bite carried history, strength, and the spirit of those who made do with what they had. Candied yams were the kind of sweet that made the kitchen feel like a celebration even on a weekday. Slices of orange yams baked in butter, sugar, and cinnamon until they glistened like amber in the pan. The smell alone could draw neighbors in from the porch. It was sticky, soft, and golden, something you did not rush or measure too carefully. It reminded people of holidays, even when there was no turkey or feast. Every spoonful was joy, simple and honest. You could taste the sweetness of survival, the warmth of love baked into every layer. Kids licked the spoons while mothers checked the oven, waiting for that caramelized crust to bubble just right. Candied yams carried a magic that turned any meal into a memory. Candied yams made ordinary days taste special, and that was their magic. They turned struggle into sweetness every single time. Fried catfish with hot sauce was the sound of oil popping, laughter from the porch, and music spilling from a radio. Each fillet was coated in cornmeal, fried crisp until the edges crunched. You'd know it was done when the smell hit, smoky and rich. It was more than dinner. It was an event, a family gathered under the same roof after a long week. You'd dip it in hot sauce and forget about the heat outside. Catfish fries were about joy, about coming together to eat, talk, and share stories long after the food was gone. The fryer hissed while voices rose in harmony, telling jokes and memories in equal measure. The golden fillets sat on paper towels, glistening like trophies of love and hard work. Kids ran around barefoot while grown folks argued over who fried it best. The air buzzed with music, the clatter of plates, and the hum of belonging. Fried catfish was more than just a meal. It was a gathering of hearts, a reminder that the best things in life often come sizzling, shared, and seasoned with love. In those moments, food was freedom. It was proof that flavor, laughter, and love could live in one pan. Cornbread with cracklins was the kind of side that made the meal whole. The batter hissed when it hit the skillet, sending out a smell that pulled everyone close. Bits of fried pork skin gave each bite a crunch that felt like reward. It was simple food, made with steady hands and a cast-iron pan that never cooled for long. The salty cracklins mixed with the sweetness of cornmeal in a way that only memory could explain. A golden crust formed on the edges, crisp and smoky, while the center stayed soft and warm. You didn't need fancy ingredients, just cornmeal, lard, and thyme. The first slice always went to the cook, a small thank you for care given freely. When served with beans, greens, or stew, it became a meal all on its own. The sound of the knife cutting through that crust echoed in quiet kitchens and crowded tables alike. Cracklin cornbread carried the sound of family, of forks scraping plates and stories being told. It was more than flavor. It was history baked golden brown, passed from one set of hands to the next. This was food that stretched beyond hunger. This was the taste of thrift, flavor built from scraps and love that refused to waste a crumb. Turkey wings with gravy were a quiet luxury, made from what was left behind after the big pieces were gone. They simmered for hours until the meat slid from the bone, soaking in a gravy thick with onions and flour. The sauce was glossy and rich, clinging to everything it touched. This was Sunday food, made slowly while church shoes dried by the door. It turned humble cuts into something you could be proud to serve. Every forkful told a story of making the most of little. Steam fogged the windows as families gathered round the table, hungry but patient. The smell of gravy felt like safety, like home after a long day. There was nothing rushed about it. Every stir, every taste test, carried care and memory. When poured over rice or mashed potatoes, it became the centerpiece of any table. Turkey wings taught people that comfort didn't come from cost, but from the hands that cooked it. They were food for the spirit, a slow-cooked reminder that love always found a way. Turkey wings with gravy were proof that comfort did not need cost. It only needed time, care, and family. Hoppin John was a meal that sang of hope and hard work, rice cooked with peas and salt pork in one big pot. It came from the South, from kitchens that knew how to stretch a meal into something more. Each bite was smoky, peppery, and full of life, eaten with quiet gratitude. Folks said it brought luck if you ate it on New Year's Day, but truthfully, it brought peace any day you needed it. The recipe changed from home to home, but its heart stayed the same. Mothers stirred it slow, tasting and adjusting until it felt right. The scent of simmering pork filled the air, wrapping everyone in warmth. Even when times were hard, this dish carried faith in better days. You could hear spoons clinking in bowls as laughter filled the room. It was food that brought generations together, each one adding their touch, their story, their hope. Hoppin John was the sound of resilience, bubbling softly on the stove. It reminded everyone that blessings could be simple and fortune could fit inside a pot. Hoppin John was a dish of faith, a reminder that even humble food could taste like fortune. Sweet potato pie was more than dessert. It was the heartbeat of the Southern table, the closing note to Sunday dinners and church gatherings that filled the soul as much as the stomach. The kitchen would glow warm with the scent of nutmeg, cinnamon, and baked crust, the air heavy with love and patience. Grandmothers mashed the sweet potatoes smooth by hand, mixing them with sugar, butter, and a touch of milk until the texture felt right. Not too thin, never too thick. Every family had its own secret ingredient, a splash of vanilla here or a pinch of lemon zest there, but the spirit was always the same. It was a pie that didn't need perfection to be perfect, because it carried the story of hands that had known work, joy, and faith. The crust would brown slow in the oven, and while it baked, the room filled with stories, laughter, and sometimes quiet reflection. Sweet potato pie wasn't about indulgence. It was about heritage, memory, and care. Even today, one bite can take you back to wooden tables, family prayers, and the sound of someone humming while they cleaned up the dishes. It was warmth you could taste, and love you could hold on a fork. Fried cabbage with bacon was proof that the simplest ingredients could turn into something extraordinary with the right hands. Cabbage, sliced thin and tossed into a hot skillet, hissed as it hit the bacon grease, filling the room with that unmistakable smoky smell that meant dinner was close. A sprinkle of salt, a shake of black pepper, maybe a dash of vinegar for those who liked it sharp. It did not take much to make it sing. This was weekday food, made in a hurry but never without heart. The bacon gave it depth, the cabbage gave it comfort, and together they made a dish that tasted like home. You could hear the crackle from another room, and everyone knew it was time to come to the table. Fried cabbage stretched to feed a family when the fridge looked empty, but it never felt like settling. It felt like making the best of what you had and being proud of it. Even today, that sizzle still feels like love passed down through the skillet. Red beans and smoked sausage simmered for hours until the whole house smelled like Sunday. You could walk in from church and know exactly what was waiting. A big pot on the stove, bubbling low, the beans soft, and the sausage giving up its flavor to the broth. This meal didn't rush anyone. It was patient, just like the people who made it. A single pot could feed 10 or more, and no one left hungry. It came from the habit of stretching every ingredient as far as it could go, turning beans, onions, and a few slices of meat into something hearty enough to carry a family through the week. A ladle full of red beans over rice wasn't just filling, it was family, fellowship, and endurance all in one bowl. You could taste history in every bite, the kind of cooking that spoke of faith and gratitude. Even today, red beans and sausage remind us that slow-cooked food was never just about eating, it was about waiting, sharing, and remembering what home feels like. Neckbones and rice were the kind of meal that turned scraps into celebration. It started with a pot, a handful of onions, and some patience, because neckbones took their time. The meat clung tight to the bone at first, but hours of simmering turned it tender enough to fall apart with a spoon. The broth thickened as it cooked, rich with flavor, and when poured over rice, it became the kind of meal that could stretch a little bit of meat into a full dinner for everyone. This dish taught families the beauty in the overlooked in making something out of almost nothing. Children might not have understood it then, but the lesson was simple. Flavor comes from care, not cost. Every bite was a story of resilience, of knowing that hard work and slow cooking could still bring joy to the table. Neckbones and rice were humble, yes, but they were sacred too, because they tasted like gratitude. Okra and tomatoes were summer on a plate, bright, tangy, and full of life from the garden. The okra was sliced thin, the tomatoes stewed soft, and together they created a balance that felt like home cooking at its purest. A single pan was all it took, yet the flavor told a story of generations who learned how to make the most of what the land gave them. Sometimes a little onion or garlic joined in, but the heart of the dish was always simple and true. It was a side that went with everything: rice, cornbread, or just a spoon by itself. The texture, smooth and slightly sticky, was comfort in its own right. Every spoonful reminded families of warm afternoons spent tending to gardens, of neighbors sharing baskets of fresh-picked vegetables across the fence. The dish connected people to their roots, to soil and seed, to hard work and love. It tasted like gratitude and sunshine, proof that nature gave enough if you treated it with respect and care. Stewed chicken with dumplings was the kind of meal that gathered everyone close. The chicken, simple and seasoned, boiled gently until it gave all its flavor to the broth. Dumplings, cut by hand from scraps of dough, floated on top like little clouds soaking in every drop of goodness. It was thick, rich, and warm enough to chase away any cold day. This was the kind of food made in one pot, where the smell alone was enough to make children set the table without being told. Each bite carried comfort and care, a reminder that love was often found in the simplest meals. The broth would bubble slow, carrying the scent of herbs, flour, and memory all at once. It was food for healing, for comfort, for hope when times were thin. Stewed chicken and dumplings were proof that good food didn't come from plenty. It came from patience, skill, and heart. Pan-fried corn was sunshine in a skillet, sweet, buttery, and golden. Fresh ears were scraped by hand, milk and all, then tossed into hot bacon grease until the kernels popped and sizzled. A sprinkle of salt, a dash of sugar, maybe a touch of pepper. It didn't need much else. The smell filled the kitchen, calling everyone to gather round. Each spoonful had that mix of sweet and savory that only Southern cooks could master. It was summer food, made from corn grown nearby, cooked while the day was still hot and bright. You could eat it by itself or scoop it beside greens and meat, but it always stole the show. The sound of it frying was like music, a melody of comfort and familiarity. It was the kind of dish that turned ordinary days into something to remember. Pan-fried corn was quick to make but impossible to forget, the kind of dish that reminded people that joy could fit inside a cast-iron skillet. Hoghead cheese or souse meat was not fancy food, but it had deep roots in tradition and respect for what you had. Made from the head of the pig, boiled, seasoned, and set in its own broth, it was a dish born from necessity and pride. It was eaten cold, sliced thin, and often shared at the table with crackers and conversation. What others might have thrown away became something flavorful and lasting in the right hands. It spoke of times when wasting food was unthinkable, when every part of the animal was used to honor the work that went into raising it. The smell of it cooking filled the whole house, sharp and strong, but it was the kind of smell that meant good things were coming. When cooled and sliced, it glistened in the light like proof of survival itself. Each piece held a story of long days, careful hands, and families who knew that resourcefulness was its own kind of wealth. Souse meat wasn't about glamour, it was about gratitude. Even if you didn't grow up eating it, the story it told was universal. Make do, make it good, and never take a meal for granted. Fried green tomatoes were a porch-side favorite, a snack for hot days and easy laughter. Slices of firm green tomatoes were dipped in cornmeal, fried golden in a skillet, and sprinkled with salt while still sizzling. The result was crisp on the outside, soft inside, and just tart enough to make your mouth water. You could eat them standing up, still hot from the pan, or stack them high beside a plate of beans and rice. They were the kind of treat you didn't plan, You just made them when the garden gave too many tomatoes. The pop of oil, the hum of conversation, and the smell of cornmeal frying turned an ordinary afternoon into something special. Kids waited by the stove, stealing pieces when the cook wasn't looking, their fingers burned but happy. Fried green tomatoes weren't just about taste, they were about time, patience, and community. Their taste was bold but humble, a reminder of summers that felt endless and simple pleasures that cost almost nothing. Fried green tomatoes were living proof that good things come to those who cook from the heart. Field peas and fatback were the taste of the land itself, grown, seasoned, and served with pride. The peas came from backyard gardens or local fields, small and hearty, full of earth and sunlight. The fatback added salt and richness, sizzling in the pot before the peas went in, turning plain beans into a meal worth remembering. This was a dish that didn't need dressing up. It was honest, filling, and true. Families cooked big pots of it to last through the week, served with rice or cornbread to soak up every drop. The kitchen would fill with steam as the peas simmered slow, their scent mixing with that smoky fat and a little black pepper. Sometimes a neighbor would knock just to see if they could grab a bowl, and there was always enough to share. It was food that reminded people that simplicity wasn't lack. It was love made visible. Field peas and fatback taught everyone that simplicity was its own kind of luxury. It was food for the body and balm for the soul, shared with neighbors and passed down like a promise. Corn pudding was that perfect middle ground between savory and sweet, a dish that could sit beside meat or stand proudly as dessert. Made with creamed corn, milk, butter, and sugar, it baked into a golden custard that jiggled just enough to make everyone lean in for a spoonful. It was often served warm, straight out of the oven, steam rising from the soft top as the smell of butter filled the room. Families would argue over whether it belonged next to the roast or after it, but no one argued about having seconds. The pudding had that rich, creamy texture that reminded you of childhood, when food wasn't fancy but always heartfelt. Some cooks added nutmeg or a splash of vanilla, while others kept it simple, letting the corn's natural sweetness speak for itself. Every bite was soft, almost melt in your mouth, and tasted like summer stored away for a rainy day. Corn pudding wasn't just a recipe, it was a reflection of resourcefulness, of turning simple crops into gold. You could find it at every holiday table, shining in its casserole dish like sunlight made edible. Even now, one taste brings back memories of laughter, blessings, and a table filled with more love than wealth. Chicken gizzards and rice were the kind of meal that proved skill mattered more than ingredients. Gizzards were tough by nature, the kind of cut most people threw away, but in careful hands they became tender treasures. The secret was time, simmering them for hours in broth with onions, garlic, and maybe a bay leaf or two until they softened enough to yield to a fork. When poured over rice, they carried the deep, savory flavor of every minute spent waiting. It was food that rewarded patience and waste nothing living. Families who grew up on it never forgot the smell, the rich steam that told you someone had been cooking since morning. This dish was born from thrift, but it never tasted like sacrifice. It was nourishment that felt earned, a quiet joy built from skill and persistence. Chicken gizzards and rice turned something humble into something worth remembering, one pot at a time. Pig feet stew wasn't for the faint-hearted. It was a dish that demanded work, time, and respect for what others overlooked. The feet simmered for hours until the collagen melted down, thickening the broth into a rich, velvety glaze that clung to the spoon. Carrots, onions, and garlic joined in, soaking up the deep pork flavor that filled the entire house. You could always tell when someone was making it. The smell of vinegar and spice told its own story. It was more than food. It was a ritual, a practice in patience and gratitude. Families who made pig feet stew knew the art of turning little into plenty. There was pride in it, in honoring every part of the animal, never letting anything go to waste. The result was a dish that felt indulgent despite its humble origins, proof that ingenuity could turn survival into celebration. Pig feet stew wasn't just cooked, it was crafted, one long simmer at a time. Turnip greens with ham hocks were the definition of simple food made sacred. The greens, bitter on their own, softened slowly in the smoky broth that ham hocks gave. You'd start early in the day, filling a pot with greens, onions, and a little garlic, then letting it bubble low until the house smelled like comfort. The hocks released their salt and fat into the water, turning it into what folks called potlikker, the good stuff you sopped up with cornbread so nothing went to waste. Each bowl was hearty, soulful, and filled with memory. It was the kind of food that filled bellies and lifted spirits during hard times. Grandmothers swore by it, saying the greens kept you strong and the potlikker kept you blessed. The pot itself was a fixture of every kitchen, blackened from years of use, carrying stories in every dent and scrape. It wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual, slow and sure, stitched into family and faith. The sound of bubbling broth was a comfort all its own, a quiet promise that things would be all right. Turnip greens with ham hocks weren't just dinner, they were a way of giving thanks for what the land and love could offer. Bread pudding with raisins was what happened when nothing went to waste, not even yesterday's loaf. Torn bread soaked in sweetened milk and eggs, flavored with nutmeg and cinnamon, then baked until golden and soft inside. The smell alone could make you pause mid-step. It was that kind of warmth that stopped conversation. The raisins puffed up in the heat, little pockets of sweetness among the creamy bread. Served with a drizzle of vanilla sauce or a pat of butter, it was humble dessert at its finest. Every family had a variation. Some added a splash of whiskey, others a handful of pecans. But the soul of the dish stayed the same. It was comfort in a pan, a reminder that love could make even leftovers feel like luxury. The first spoonful melted on the tongue, rich and warm like memory itself. It was dessert born from thrift, yet rich with care and intention. Bread pudding taught generations that sweetness could come from struggle, that beauty could rise from what others might overlook. Bread pudding was more than dessert. It was a story of making do, of finding sweetness in scarcity, and of turning simple things into something unforgettable. Butter beans with salt pork were a quiet hero on the dinner table, a dish that didn't need praise to be loved. The beans simmered slow, creamy, and soft, soaking in the smoky salt of pork pieces that melted as they cooked. The broth turned rich and silky, the kind that begged for a piece of cornbread to soak it up. This was working food, filling and steady, made to last through long days. Every spoonful carried warmth and a hint of nostalgia. The smell of simmering butter beans brought neighbors to knock, asking if they could lend a hand or a bowl. It was the kind of meal that gathered people without invitation, simple and generous all at once. Butter beans with salt pork weren't showy, but they were loved. You could hear laughter rise above the table as spoons clinked and bowls emptied fast. It was a dish that knew how to stretch, how to serve plenty when little was all you had. These beans were patience made visible, a slow-cooked reminder that comfort comes to those who wait. They reminded everyone that flavor was never about fancy. It was about time, care, and the comfort of something cooked just right. Fried okra with cornmeal crust was a small luxury with big flavor. Each piece was coated in cornmeal, salt, and pepper, then dropped into hot oil until it sizzled and browned. The result was crispy outside, tender inside, a perfect mix of crunch and warmth. You didn't need a reason to fry okra. Sometimes you just did it because the day felt long and you wanted something to smile about. It was eaten by the handful, sometimes before it even hit the table. Kids loved the bite-sized pieces. Grown folks loved the taste of childhood they carried. It paired with anything, but truthfully, it stood just fine on its own. Fried okra was joy disguised as simplicity, a golden reminder that a little grease and patience could make anything better. Stewed tomatoes and rice were a Depression-era miracle, born from necessity but remembered for comfort. Tomatoes stewed down until soft and tangy, mixed with rice that soaked up every drop of flavor. Sometimes a little sugar was added to balance the bite, sometimes onions or bell peppers joined in for depth. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. It filled the belly, warmed the heart, and reminded people that simple could still mean special. For many, It was dinner after long days in the field or factory when money was tight but pride was strong. The steam rising from the pot carried both memory and gratitude. Even when meat was scarce, stewed tomatoes and rice made sure no one went to bed hungry. It was the taste of care and perseverance wrapped in one humble bowl. Peach cobbler with biscuit crust was sunshine baked into dessert form. Juicy peaches simmered with sugar and a little spice until their juices bubbled thick. On top went dollops of biscuit dough, browned to perfection and soaking in the syrup beneath. It smelled like summer evenings and sounded like laughter when the spoon broke through the crust. Served with a scoop of cream or ice cream, it felt like joy in a dish. Families made it from fresh fruit when they could, canned peaches when they couldn't. It didn't matter, because the love stayed the same. Peach cobbler was passed around after church, after long days, or just because someone felt generous. It was sweet, golden, and proud. A dessert that said, "We made it through." Every bite tasted like gratitude. Cracklin cornbread dressing was the soul of Thanksgiving tables, dense, rich, and full of flavor that spoke of home. Cornbread crumbled and mixed with onions, celery, sage, and stock, while crispy cracklins added bursts of salty crunch. It baked until the top was golden brown and the inside soft as memory. The smell of sage and roasting bread filled the air, and every bite carried warmth and love. Families argued over who made it best, but everyone knew it wasn't Thanksgiving without it. Each pan told a story of heritage, of hands that cooked with care, and of hearts that celebrated through food. Cracklin cornbread dressing was never just a side, it was tradition, a reminder that love always tastes better when shared. Collard greens with ham hocks were a kind of southern poetry in a pot. Every batch began with water, greens, and a meaty ham hock that filled the kitchen with the scent of home. The greens simmered slowly, wilting into something rich and earthy while the hock gave off its smoky depth. This wasn't a quick meal. It was an act of devotion, a ritual that demanded time and patience. Every generation had its own trick for getting them just right. Maybe a dash of vinegar, a sprinkle of sugar, or a secret seasoning passed down by word of mouth. Collards carried pride, not pity. They were the food of workers, field hands, and families that knew the meaning of resilience. Served alongside cornbread, they became the soul of Sunday dinners, a moment when everyone gathered to taste a little peace after a week of hard living. The broth, or potlikker, was so treasured it was sipped from cups when the greens were gone. And every spoonful was survival seasoned with hope. Collard greens with ham hocks stood as proof that even in the toughest times, comfort could still be coaxed from the simplest things. Pot scrappin' soup was the kind of meal that made use of every last bit that life gave. When the pantry was empty, people turned to what clung to the bottom of the pot. They poured in hot water, scraped up every browned edge and leftover piece of vegetable or meat, and built a new meal from what was left behind. It simmered for hours until the flavors came together, smoky and deep, with hints of salt and spice from earlier meals. No two pots ever tasted the same, and that was the beauty of it. Sometimes it had bits of onion, sometimes beans or bones, always something saved from before. It filled the air with a smell of gratitude, the kind that made even the poorest home feel rich. Children dunked stale cornbread in it, soaking up every drop. Pot scrappin' soup reminded families that nothing was ever truly gone, not flavor, not hope, not care. It turned waste into warmth and leftovers into love. The sound of that bubbling pot was a hymn for survival, proof that the end of the week still had something worth waiting for. Cornmeal batter cakes were one of the simplest meals that could appear on a Southern table, and they carried generations of tradition within them. Families would take cornmeal, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt, stir it into a thin batter, and fry it on a hot griddle until crisp at the edges. They were plain, but they filled stomachs and could be eaten with molasses, honey, or drippings if there was any to spare. For children heading to school or workers starting long days in the fields, these cakes offered quick energy without costing much. Cornmeal was one of the most dependable ingredients because it was cheap, easy to store, and produced in abundance across the South. A few scoops stretched further than wheat flour, and it did not require yeast or fancy preparation. Cornmeal batter cakes might have been plain, but in households facing hunger, they meant survival and warmth. They were a food that held families steady when little else did. Wild plum. Chutney offered a burst of tart sweetness when sugar was scarce and fruit trees grew untended along plantation edges. Gatherers picked the small, deeply colored plums at peak ripeness and simmered them slowly with a little honey or molasses when available, along with wild herbs for spice. The result was a tangy preserve that enlivened cornbread, salted meats, or simple porridge, providing vitamins and variety in otherwise plain meals. This method of combining fruit with savory seasonings echoed West African chutneys and relishes, demonstrating a culinary bridge between continents. After freedom, African-American home cooks continued to prize wild plums for jellies and sauces, and many Southern families still make small-batch plum preserves each summer. The enduring appeal of wild plum chutney lies in its ability to turn overlooked fruit into a bright condiment that brightens any table. It stands as a flavorful link between survival cooking and the rich tapestry of modern Southern preserves that celebrate both heritage and the gifts of the wild landscape. Fried green tomato. Po' boys turned unripe tomatoes into a sandwich that tasted like pure coastal sunshine wrapped in crunchy cornmeal. Thick slices of firm green tomatoes were dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried until their edges crisped and their centers softened just enough to release a bright tang. Piled high on soft French bread with a smear of remoulade and a handful of shredded lettuce, they became a favorite along Gulf Coast streets where shrimp boats docked and music floated from open windows. Vendors often sold them at fish fries and fairs when seafood prices climbed too high, proving that a garden vegetable could carry the day as well as any oyster or crab. Families remembered the scent of hot oil and the pop of cornmeal batter while waiting in line for a sandwich that blended thrift and celebration. Today, fast food counters try to imitate the flavor, but they cannot capture the quiet magic of fresh garden tomatoes picked before ripening, fried in backyard kitchens, and shared among neighbors who knew the value of every bite. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap Southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth, but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Fried cabbage with bacon grease was the meal you made when the pantry looked bare, but your will stayed strong. A head of cabbage, a bit of onion, and a spoonful of saved bacon grease could stretch into supper for an entire family. The crackle of the skillet filled the kitchen like music, turning simple leaves into something rich and smoky. This dish carried the scent of thrift and memory, the kind that lingered long after the plates were empty. The secret was balance, enough fat for flavor, enough salt for soul, and enough patience to let it caramelize just right. Cabbage may have been cheap, but it was treated like gold by those who knew its worth. Served hot with a piece of cornbread or rice, it became proof that a meal didn't have to be fancy to feel like a blessing. Fried cabbage with bacon grease was more than sustenance. It was pride in a pan. Each bite told a story of survival, of turning scarcity into satisfaction. It was the art of making the ordinary taste extraordinary, one skillet at a time. Churn milk soup was what you made when you had finished making butter and still needed a meal. That leftover buttermilk became the base for a tangy, hearty soup that could feed a family from a single pot. It was mixed with cornmeal, herbs, and whatever vegetables were on hand, then simmered until it thickened like velvet. The smell was sharp but cozy, filling the kitchen with warmth and familiarity. Some families dropped bits of bread into the bowl, letting it soak up the flavor. It was simple food, born from old farm routines and frugal wisdom. Churn milk soup taught that nothing should ever be wasted, not even the scraps of a good day's work. It soothed hunger and reminded everyone that comfort could come from the most ordinary things. With each spoonful, it carried the echo of laughter and work from generations before. Collard green Potlikker soup was proof that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. After collard greens were boiled with ham hocks or smoked meat, the leftover broth was packed with nutrients and flavor. Families would save it, thicken it with beans, rice, or cornbread crumbs, and serve it as a soup. It turned what could have been discarded liquid into a meal that could stretch for days. Potlikker was praised for its richness and vitamins, especially during times when fresh vegetables were limited. Black families in the South cherished it as part of their food culture, a reminder that even scraps held value. The taste of Potlikker soup was smoky, salty, and comforting, carrying both sustenance and heritage in every bowl. It reminded people that resourcefulness was a form of survival and strength. For many households, it was a dish that fed both body and spirit when times were most difficult. Roasted chestnuts carried warmth and nourishment through the cold months when plantation rations were meager and gardens lay dormant. Enslaved families foraged chestnut trees that grew wild in the surrounding woods, gathering the smooth brown nuts and roasting them in hearth ashes or iron skillets until their shells cracked and the sweet flesh softened. The nuts' high energy content and natural sweetness made it an important source of calories and comfort, especially during long winter evenings. Roasted chestnuts became part of a wider African-American food tradition, appearing in holiday celebrations and roadside markets after emancipation. Their gentle flavor paired well with cornmeal breads and simple stews, and many families passed down techniques for roasting and storing them long after the plantation era ended. Today, roasted chestnuts sold at winter festivals and city street corners carry echoes of that history, reminding us that what began as a survival practice also nurtured community and seasonal ritual for generations who transformed hardship into enduring culture. Okra and tomato succotash brought color and heritage together in one bubbling skillet. Fresh okra pods, sliced thin, mingled with sweet ripe tomatoes, corn kernels, onions, and peppers, creating a medley that linked West African traditions with Native American harvests. The dish simmered until the vegetables melded into a savory stew, thickened naturally by the okra's silken texture. Farmers' markets once overflowed with the ingredients every late summer, and families counted on succotash to stretch their crops and fill their tables. It was a side dish that could stand as a main course when meat was scarce, and its bright flavors paired beautifully with cornbread or rice. Elders told stories of ancestors who carried seeds and memories across oceans and frontiers, weaving history into every spoonful. Though many still grow okra and corn, the slow, careful preparation of true succotash has become rare, replaced by frozen blends and quick sautés that cannot match the patient flavor of the old garden skillet. Stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a dish that blended frugality with comfort in a way that stuck with families for decades. Okra, often grown in backyard gardens, went into a simmering pot with onions, tomatoes, and broth until it softened into a thick stew. My grandmother would mix simple cornmeal batter, drop spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, and let the dumplings cook until they puffed into tender bites. The texture of the okra thickened the stew naturally, giving it body without needing flour or cream. Each bowl carried the flavor of the garden, earthy and sustaining, with dumplings that filled the stomachs of tired workers. It was food that came straight from the soil and stretched further than its ingredients suggested. Children grew up eating this dish as a matter of routine, yet it became part of the rhythm of survival. In the 1960s, stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a staple that represented both thrift and ingenuity, turning humble vegetables and flour into something worthy of pride at the dinner table. Catfish stew was born from the rivers that fed hungry families when money could not. It was a fisherman's meal, made with whatever the day's catch brought in and whatever else could be spared. The fish simmered with onions, peppers, and a few spices until the broth turned hearty and golden. Sometimes a few potatoes or tomatoes joined the pot to stretch the servings further. The flavor was bold, earthy, and honest, born of water, labor, and faith. Along the banks of muddy rivers, folks gathered to clean, season, and cook together, turning scarcity into celebration. Every spoonful tasted of resilience, the kind that came from knowing you could always find a way. Catfish stew wasn't just dinner, it was fellowship, a gathering around the fire with laughter and storytelling. Even when the world seemed empty, this stew filled bellies and hearts alike. It was the living memory of a people who found abundance in places others overlooked, a symbol of perseverance floating in a pot of simple, sustaining joy. If these soul foods stirred your memories, comment your favorite, like the video, and subscribe to keep their stories alive.